Imagine trying to fill a leaky bucket with water. You pour more in. So for learning, we read more, highlight more, watch another video, but nothing sticks. It just keeps pouring out. That's what learning feels like when your attention's scattered and your memory really isn't engaged. But here's a twist. Your brain isn't broken. It's just working without a strategy. The tools for better learning like focus, attention, retrieval, metacognition are already built in. You just need to know how to use them. So we're going to take a deep dive into learning theory and learn more about learning. We're going to learn about learning.
Yes.
This is George Hanchon. I am here with Shannon Hunt and Craig Brewer, our two psychology experts. We're going to discuss. We're going to learn about learning. So, Craig and Shannon, welcome. And how do we define learning and cognition? How would you define it, even before we jump into the theories?
I'm happy to start with that, George. And so, learning's a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge due to experience. That's a general definition. Cognition is the mental processes involved in acquiring, processing, storing, and retrieving information. So it includes perception, memory, reasoning, and problem solving.
So cognition is kind of the how then.
Yes.
Okay. Shannon, what's your thought?
You mentioned something about, when you're talking about defining learning, relative permanency. Is that how you described it?
Yeah, relatively permanent change in behavior based on knowledge due to experience. So there's a change that's going to be relatively permanent.
Right. And so I'd love to hear why you guys think that it's relatively permanent. Why is learning something that's relatively permanent as opposed to permanent? What do you think?
Oh, can I go on that one?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, George.
My first dive into learning was in training and development. So training, right? And our definition was learning is a change in behavior. And the relative or maybe non-permanent was because your skills can deteriorate after a while. I guess deteriorate is the right word for it, but your skill can decline over time or lack of use.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we went with that all the time. But that was before I actually learned more about learning, and I was training and development, which was a lot of fun. But what's the real deal, Shannon? You sound like you have the real deal.
No, I just wanted to hear your thoughts. That I appreciate the considerations of sometimes not using some of our knowledge we lose some of that too. So relatively permanent. If it was permanent, we wouldn't be able to lose some of our knowledge, right? So we might study something for a test and I might go in, I might ace that test, right? But give me a month later, I might remember none of the information on that test. So that's where that relatively permanent information comes into play too, because some things we learn and we store in our short-term memory and we use it right then, and it's not something that we have maintained and we don't remember it. And so that's that piece right there. But I think you targeted that really nicely, George, too. And if we don't keep using it, sometimes we lose that knowledge and that learning from that. Yeah.
Yeah, and what we talked about, it was about repetition. So if we continue to repeat it in different ways, we're going to be more likely to retain it. But there's many things in my short-term memory that I'm not going to remember tomorrow because I haven't retained it enough. And so I think that's one of the fascinating things about learning is that it's not black or white. You learned it or you didn't learn it. It's we learn things, but we don't retain all that we learn unless we're intentional about it through repetition or other strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I love that. So it'd be kind of like going to the gym one time and saying, I'm fit.
Right.
I'm
Wouldn't
good
that
to go.
Nice? Right. There's so much to say about attention and repetition and how that helps us to have more permanent learning with that as well. But there's actually a number of theories that speak to how we learn. Craig and George, do you have a particular theory that you really love and think really resonates with how we learn?
I'd like to start with just the behavioral or behaviorism theory, because that's one of the foundational ones. And I've got a few dogs at home. And so I've been able to kind of see this work out. So many of you have heard of Pavlov, and he came up with this idea of classical conditioning that we learn through an association. And the example that he gives is when he rings the bell when they're feeding the dog eventually begins to salivate at the sound of the bell alone. And so I've got 3 dogs at home, and I've got a really big dog, and he knows when it's time to eat at 5 p.m. And so he starts coming around, and he's aware that it's time to eat. I take him outside, and all of a sudden he's slobbering all over the glass window, and I haven't even started to feed him yet. I'm like, hold on. But what we can see is that association. He knows he's going to get fed, and so he begins salivating as a result of it. So it's pretty fascinating to look at that classical conditional modeling. And then the other one's operant conditioning as well. And that's how we learn through consequences. So reinforcement. With my dogs, this is a common thing as well. If I give them a treat, if there's something that they're going to get out of it, they'll continue in the behavior. But if there's no treat or nothing, then they oftentimes won't. And so I think those are just 2 fundamental concepts of behaviorism.
You know what I love about that, Craig, is so when we're talking about work, so let's talk about an organization real quick, a team. If you have upside down consequences, or in other words, for that operant conditioning, if the hard charging great worker that gets things done, if their entire reward is just work piled on, where somebody who's maybe not as good gets like literally nothing to do, you can transform your entire team and organization into something that does not work.
Right.
It's kind of amazing from
that.
Yeah.
And so, George, you're bringing up organizational psychology and the organizational dynamics. So applying it to the workplace is a really helpful way to think about it. And if we're continuing, if you've got someone that's working a lot and there's no reward in it, other people see that, right? And they realize, okay, well, why should I work that hard? And so that gets to our incentives and how we incentivize and how we motivate other people. But I think that's a great example.
And Shannon, you have a lot of experience with this. What?
You know what? One of the things I appreciate about behaviorism approaches is the empirical data associated with it. I have a lot of students who serve in the field of applied behavior analysis. So it's known as ABA. And a lot of them are working with children who have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And they can relay about operant conditioning, just like this, and they can tell you how to use reinforcement in so many different scenarios to help to reinforce behaviors that they actually want the students or the children they're working with to move towards, right? So desirable behaviors. And also the correct terminology in operant conditioning is punishment. Punishment is not something like, it's always like, you did something wrong, I'm taking this away. Punishment, again, is to diminish a behavior. So I love when my students are giving examples of how they're using operant conditioning, whether it's reinforcement or punishment, in order to shape behaviors. And we can do it really in the direction we don't want it to happen. Georgia gave an example, but let's talk about, everyone has had children, or they've seen children going through the aisle at the checkout at the grocery store, and they might be, yelling for the candy or something on the aisle that they want before they leave. Well, if mom or dad or babysitter or caregiver gives that candy to the child, well, that just reinforces that behavior of screaming and begging for what they want. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what operant conditioning is. But we see evidence that approach to learning actually works. There are multiple approaches to learning, which we're going to touch on today, these different theories. But we do have evidence that behaviorism works. And I can tell you, with students that I've worked with and just those who I know who've worked in the field in ABA therapy, we see such great evidence of how using these approaches of operant conditioning can help shape behaviors that we want to see, and also break down behaviors that we want to end as well.
Amazing. So so you gave the example of the child screaming, and if you give into it, that's literally a learned behavior. It says, hey,
Right.
that worked.
Yes.
I can get what I want. Man, I can do that. So, and we see that play out in adulthood too, right? Even as children
Absolutely.
get older, we see that play out in many different circumstances. So, learning is really complex. So that's our behaviorism sort of part. Big shout out to the LAPU students who
Oh yeah,
and the ABA programs that just know how to just knock
they
this
do
stuff
so well. Yeah.
right out. Uh, so with behaviorism, and we connected it already to organizations, individuals, people, but it really connects back to that definition that a lot of people hold is learning is a change in behavior.
Mm.
So behaviorism makes a lot of just street sense, if you will,
Mhm, mhm.
because if
Yeah.
learning is a change in behavior, and I know that's not the only definition, but it's a widely held,
And
right?
it's external too, George. It's an external thing that we're observing. It's not happening internally in us in the same way as the cognitivism theory, where that theory is looking at learning as an internal process where we're
Right.
continually evolving and transforming information. And so that's the difference. You've got something external, it's what I observe, versus it's internal, what I'm thinking.
Now, how do we? Here's the question that I always kind of bump into. So behavior is pretty easy to measure because you can see it, right?
Right.
Now you brought in cognitivism is a little bit more internal. Well, it is more internal, not a little bit. It is internal, right?
Right.
Just call it what it is. It's internal. How is it more difficult to measure that? To say, hey, we've accomplished X, we've accomplished Y?
That's a
Or do we
great.
have to turn it into behaviors to measure?
Excellent question, George. It's easier, obviously, to measure something that's happening externally than something that's happening internally, right? Our thinking and our processing. But I would also argue that when we think about cognitive development, it is going to change our behavior ultimately as well. And so with children, we look at there's distinct stages that they go through as part of this cognitive development. And it's fascinating. One of the concepts is about information processing model. There's encoding, storing, and then retrieval. And then Bruner's got this concept of discovery learning. It's where learners build new ideas based on current past knowledge. So it's almost as though we're continuing to build. You could think of it as building blocks. We have a foundation, and then we continue just to build higher and higher on that as we go through these different stages of development.
And I think you're probably referring to Piaget there and his stages of development. And there's been a lot of great thinking with that as well. George, to your question too, like, okay, can we measure cognitive learning? And I think we do that a lot in classrooms, whether it's, second grade or grad school, wherever you're at. If they have things like quizzes, that's going to help measure the learning that's taken place. If they're able to ace a quiz or not, did they learn something along the way? So I think it's certainly ways that we can measure cognitive learning. But I think too, if we are able to, for example, if we are working with clients and in a therapeutic type of sense, and they're trying to learn to manage their thoughts world. So think of, in our world, we're talking about metacognition, but when we're working with clients, we're just trying to help them use terminology like manage their thoughts. It could be anything from trying to not allow anxiety to take over their thought world, no more ruminating, maybe thinking of themselves in a higher view, maybe to decrease the number of negative thoughts about self and increase the number of positive thoughts about self. So I think that there are ways that we can look at cognitive growth and learning too, just in the and we'll have to use behaviors in order to oftentimes to be able to report on it. You have to be able to share about it. You might have to write it down, but we're able to look at growth in terms of managing thoughts, changing our thoughts in terms of, again, maybe if someone has constantly berating themselves mentally and note and maybe documenting all those thoughts during the day. And then they start changing and adding some positive thinking about themselves too, and keeping a column. Okay, here's berating myself. Here are positive thoughts. And we see a switch. The more you practice having positive self-talk, we see growth and learning taking place in that area too. What do you think?
You know what's interesting about that? So my dissertation was on self-talk and mental imagery.
Okay.
And I was actually lucky enough to get it published with the APA. And really, as you look, self-talk is so important because what you tell yourself literally matters. So in the case of my dissertation, we were looking at martial artists and their response time to a stimulus. So a light would beep, or a light would go off and a beep at the same time. And we'd see how fast they could, how much time it took them to strike this pad that we had, right?
Mm-hmm.
And folks that used the appropriate self-talk they got, I forget the exact number now, but it was significantly faster than if they didn't use anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they didn't use anything, they get lost in their own self-talk. I have to be faster this time than I was last time. They get stuck in that. So your self-talk can have a physical ramification, really. And in this case, it was speed, right? It was speed in response, which was kind of cool that mental process can affect literally how fast you are.
That's good. I love that. I haven't read your article. I'm going to have to go back and read it. That's good.
Right before bedtime, and
right.
So that's kind of neat, though, how those cognitive processes have a very physical effect.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So as we're thinking about that, then that kind of makes me lean towards social learning. So we're social beings, right? We're not meant to be in isolation. We're social beings. How does social learning kind of factor into this?
Mm-hmm.
And what is social learning?
I would say probably, and Craig, jump in when you want to here, but I'll just kind of give us a brief description, and Craig, you can pop in here. Social learning theory, if we're just bare bones here, is learning from other people, right? We see what other people around us are doing, and we learn from that, and we absorb that. There's so many times you can see children who behave a lot like their parents, right? They might talk the same way. They might have similar mannerisms, that type of thing. There's different phrasing that they're going to use in, let's say, the southern part of the United States than the northern part of the United States. There's different accents that people use. Like, we learn from our social experiences around us. So that is the crux of social learning theory. There's some really cool elements of it too, like the NKO and different things like that. So I'm going to give Craig some opportunity to speak here too, but I love social learning theory because I see a lot of teeth in it as well.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Shannon. And with social learning theory, the common thing that happens with parents when they bring their kids to preschool and their kids say something or use profanity, oftentimes the teacher knows where did you learn that, right? So our children oftentimes mirror what they learn from home from us. There's this concept within Vygotsky's sociocultural theory that talks about this zone of proximity and development, ZPD. Mm-hmm. And the definition of that is, this is the gap between what a learner can do independently and what they can do with guidance from a more knowledgeable other. So this is a teacher, peer, or parent. And so when we see it in action, what we see is, for example, like a child can solve a simple addition problem, right? But they may struggle with subtraction and a number of other more complicated things. But with help, if they have someone coming beside them, that's where we really see a lot of learning happen. And that's what we see with teaching in the classroom. We see teachers coming alongside of the students to assist them in that. And then there's this concept I want to share real quickly about scaffolding. And so with scaffolding, some examples of that, it's temporary support given to a learner to help them master a task or concept. And so with scaffolding, what you're doing is you're working and you're building on other concepts. And so some examples of this would be, as a teacher, we would ask guiding questions instead of giving answers. so that we can allow the student to really learn and process, breaking things into smaller, more manageable steps. We do that all the time in our curriculum at LAPU. Rather than having an overwhelming large assignment, we try to break that up and say, okay, let's break it into chunks. By breaking it into chunks, we also give teachers the opportunity to pour into that and to give feedback on it. Providing hints or models is another way to do that. And then lastly, gradually removing support is competency increases. So the goal of scaffolding is to encourage independent learning by gradually transferring this responsibility to the student. So we're playing an active role with the student in coaching and mentoring, but our goal isn't that student would be dependent on us for the answers. We want to teach the student to fish, right? So that they can do it for themselves. And so I think it's really an interesting concept.
And you really have to be able to, when we're talking about the sociocultural piece,
right.
And Shannon, I'll let you get into MKO because I know you love that piece, and so do I. So I'm gonna lead up to that, if I may, from what Craig said as well. You really have to be willing as a human, as a person, to learn from anywhere, not necessarily from a hierarchical structure, but you have to be able to learn from anywhere. Because it brought a story to my mind when you were both speaking. Brought a couple of them, but what's in it? I'll tell my Father of the Year award that I did not win. So I came home from work and I was tired, and my son said, "Dad, I want to put my skateboard wheels on my scooter and my scooter wheels on my skateboard." And me, I'm an aircraft mechanic for many years, right?
Yeah.
I'm like,
sure.
In my head, I'm like, dude, that's not going to work. That's just dumb. I'm thinking that in my head. I said, you know what, man, my toolbox is over there. Have at it. Dad needs to take a nap or whatever. I wasn't taking a nap, but I just didn't have it. Man, 10 minutes later, he comes scooting by in a scooter with these itty bitty skateboard wheels on it. I'm like, okay, check. Learned something.
Learned something. Yeah.
Learned that. And then what he told me, and this is a kid, he was like 8 or 9 or something like that. He says, it doesn't go very fast because the wheels are so small now. And I was like, learning. And then I learned right from him. So you can learn from anywhere at any time.
So true.
And because that brings us into more knowledgeable others, MKO. Many 8-year-olds are MKOs to me. So,
wait, wasn't there that show like something about a 5th grader, or are you smarter than your 5th grade? Do you remember the show?
Yes, there was.
And I'm like, why does this child know more than me, and on a lot of things? And so it was very humbling to watch shows like that. And so I love it. Do you want me to go ahead and segue, or did you have something else you wanted to share?
Yeah. What are your thoughts about it? And more knowledgeable others, MKOs. I think that's a great topic to hit.
I just like the initials too, MKO. It sounds like there's something fresh going on, but it's more knowledgeable others. And the key to learning here is finding someone, and it could be your child, that has a more knowledge than you on a certain topic. And so the MKO, the more knowledgeable other, is the person we're learning from. And this is so practical in all parts of life. I mean, in a classroom, it could be a teacher, a professor would be the MKO, right? But let's look at this broader in life too. We know that there's a lot of benefits to mentoring. So we usually find a mentor who is actually an MKO, more knowledgeable than we are on a certain topic. So for example, if I'm getting ready to break into a field and I am a college student, I'm going to want to learn more about that field and get my feet wet. So I am going to maybe set up meetings with someone who is an MKO, maybe someone already experienced in the field, someone I can maybe learn and be mentored by. So I can learn from them about the field that I'm going to be going into. George, you gave an example of your kiddo. My son just graduated from college and he is in the cybersecurity field. I would like to say I have knowledge about that field. I don't at all. I am asking him questions all the time. And so he is the MKO to me about cybersecurity. I will ask him, should I open this link? And he he will guide me in these things because that's his area of expertise. And so we want people who we can put in that role of MKO in our life because, again, social learning, we're learning from them, right? They're sharing their experience with us. And a part of that theory too, George and Craig, is the cultural part too, the social cultural theory. So we are learning from our culture too, and we can segue, we can use MKOs who are knowledgeable about other cultures too and learn about them. But just so we know what we learn about language and different parts about important part of memory and learning, we are learning from our culture too. But I'm going to hand that off because I kind of segued into the second part of the theory about culture. What do you guys think about how culture helps us learn? What are we learning from the culture around us?
Ooh, that's good. Craig, did you want that one?
Yeah, I'll just start quickly, George, and I'll hand it over to you. One of the things I always find fascinating is how much we do learn from the culture. And our culture tells us what's right and wrong, what's acceptable. And so there's a lot of things that we don't even explicitly realize that we're learning from culture, but we implicitly begin to behave in such a way so that we're acceptable within the culture that we're in. And so because of that, I think it's so fascinating to look at other cultures and get outside of my own culture to try to help understand our own biases. So I'll give you an example of that. I'm working on this ministry application of preaching a message and looking at it from today in the application of today's culture. But the issue that I have is I can't get outside of my own culture because I'm in it and I'm inundated in it. But if I go back to some of the theologians of the past in the 1600s and I listen to how they preach a message, it takes me out of my current culture enough to be able to see, I can kind of begin seeing that. So one of the challenges I think we have, I talked about the difficulty with being objective. We are subjective because we're living in a culture and we're impacted by it. And it's hard. Oftentimes we've got these blinders on where we don't even see how much we're biased or impacted by our culture. So I love looking at theologians of the past just to help me get out of that mindset enough to begin to think about it in a different way.
That's super interesting because a lot of times everybody has a definition of culture, and you can learn that from many different places. Like when I got to my first Air Force duty station, there was a culture there at that station that I learned really quickly. And so I went from 17 years old out of high school and then ended up my first duty station. I was just 18 years old. I did not know anything, period. I was dumber then than I am now, which is not saying a whole lot, but I didn't know how to act, right? So I was always looking to, JD was my technical trainer that was there because they pair you up with a journeyman mechanic. And so I was always looking to him to say, okay, how should I act? What should I do? And the first thing that he taught me when I was there, he says, when you get here, because there were some other people that were just kind of standing around talking, he says, we don't do that. He said,
right.
We go directly to work. There's always something to do. So that's what I learned. Okay, so that's part of our culture. That's what we do. We don't sit around and chat. We get to work, right? And I was like, okay, so that's culture as well, right? Because he taught me by me looking at him because I didn't know nothing. I was like, well, what do I do, man? What do I do? He said, get to work. Okay, going to work. And it's can be so healthy to be able to have those role models, those different people to look to kind of help guide you within that culture.
Yeah. And so to your point, George, when I think culture, I think I've got a Western mindset culture, big picture. But then if I look deeper, if I go underneath that, I look at what's the subculture I'm involved in. Higher education, go Christian higher education. There's subcultures within the culture, and those are all shaping us and impacting us. So again, it's fascinating to look and see all these different impacts that we have in those subcultures and how they ultimately impact how we behave. And so we're not in a vacuum at all as individuals. We are so impacted by our culture. And again, there's so many different cultures. The LAPU culture is one that I really have enjoyed, and that's been a difference for me being in a Christian work community. And I'll give you just one example. In the LAPU culture, we oftentimes pray before we do meetings. And at first, that was a learning curve for me. It's like, okay, well, isn't prayer something we do at church? And now we're doing it in the workplace. Well, now 7 years later, it's become pretty standard for me, and I'm used to that culture. And so it's a norm. It's become a norm for me, and I'm comfortable in it. But initially, it was different. And so I think, again, when we look at our culture, there's a lot of things within our culture, and there's different cultures too that we're involved in, and we're oftentimes adapting. So there's also this concept about how we adapt and we change our behavior depending on the subcultures that we're in. So if I'm at home with my family and that subculture, I can be a certain way and I can be a little bit more comfortable, being a little bit more open and honest. If I'm serving in my church, I'm probably not going to be quite in that subculture. I've got a different behavior. So it's not that I'm a different person, but I'm responding a little bit differently in each of those subcultures based on what I've learned about appropriate action and how to behave in the right way.
Can I speak to that just for a second? I just think that's a really important point too. And we are an institution and we're training our students. This is for the psychology program. So we are training our students to be ethical professionals. And part of the approach to being a highly ethical professional is making sure that we do not impose our own beliefs, whether that's religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, and practices onto clients. And so it's important, you're talking about adapting, Craig, and it's important that we will adapt our approaches when we're interacting with clients, patients, students, whoever the population is we're working with, that we adapt to their beliefs and their practices, and we inquire about that. And that's also the inquiry part too, is part of cultural humility, recognizing that we don't know everything and we need to find out from people what's a priority to them, what practices they want us to know about, and how they can incorporate that maybe in a therapeutic setting, and what their beliefs are. And so that part of culture is really important as professionals, as students out there listening, to make sure that we recognize bias. I think Craig mentioned that earlier. We recognize our biases. We hold on to our assumptions. We don't allow assumptions to lead the way. We don't impose our beliefs and practices on the clients. On the other spectrum, we are very humble and sensitive and caring and inquisitive. So we make sure that we are adapting our approach to the needs and the cultural values, beliefs, and practices of our clients. So in terms of the theory, social learning theory, we need to learn from others. They are the MKO in their life, right? So we are learning from our clients. They are the expert in their life.
Yes.
So we need to learn from them how we can best adapt our approaches to meet their needs.
I love that, Shannon. And it gets back to humility as well, and not thinking just because I have certain answers or beliefs doesn't mean that when I'm working with clients that I'm going to impose those beliefs onto them, right? We want them to share their beliefs with us so I can get to understand them a little bit differently. So I think that this idea about the different subcultures, and then thinking through how can we have to behave differently in some of these subcultures based on what those rules or norms are to be effective in our roles.
Sure.
That is so powerful. So to just wrap this up, we've gone over several learning theories. There's more out there.
Right.
I don't think we touched on constructivism, but be your own MKO and look something up for
Right.
constructivism and find that out, because our goal here was to hit the very practical applications of these learning theories in real life. And I think we did that really well. And I love the last comments were about asking questions and being curious, because the questions you ask are worth so much more than the knowledge you hold. So be humble, learn, and ask questions, because that's the only way that we can grow. So this has been brought to you by the Psychology Department at Los Angeles Pacific University, and this is what learning feels like.